Facebook. I'm Erie Times News online reporter Sarah Grabsky. I am joined today with reporter David Bruce. We are talking about the Kanzius device and the project and kind of some of the history and the controversy that has surrounded. David has been covering the Kanzius project for years now, so this is kind of a new sort of chat for us because we don't have a guest today. David is our guest, so he's going to be kind of giving some of his expertise from his reporting. He will, answer what he pretty much can, but behind the camera today we have our photography supervisor, Christopher Millette. He's going to be fielding your comments, suggestions, questions. Basically, we will do the best we can to be able to answer those today. So if you're just joining us, we are doing a Facebook Live discussion today. We are open to your comments and questions. So we're going to kind of bring the audience up to speed. David, kind of going back years, give us some background and the history behind the project.
This all started about 17 years ago. Local broadcaster John Kanzius, who many folks in the community knew because he was a co-owner for Jet Broadcasting. He was involved both with WJET TV and with Jet 1400 and then later on it was an FM station. So he was well known in the community. He developed a rare blood cancer, and while he was being treated for the cancer with chemotherapy, he came across an idea, and he talked about this many times, and it was written about and broadcast in the 60 Minutes shows that followed his case. He thought, what about radio waves? As a broadcaster, he knew how powerful radio waves were, and an interesting phenomenon that if he stood next to the tower, the broadcasting tower, that he couldn't feel any heat, but if he held a penny in his hands or a small piece of metal, it would get really, really hot. He thought, well, what about using that to treat cancer, to burn and destroy cancer cells? So what he did back in 2002, 2003 was experiment. Now, John lived part of the year in Mill Creek Township and the other half in Sanibel, Florida. And he started experimenting in his garage at Sanibel in his winter home. He took pie plates, metal pie plates, he took copper wiring, and he took raw hot dogs. And he jury-rigged a radio field, and he bombarded the hot dogs with metal inside of them with radio waves, and he found that the hot dogs not only they heated so quickly they burst, kind of like you do when they're in a little bit in a microwave, but very quickly. So he was absolutely just consumed with this idea of this is a possible way to treat cancer without all of the nasty side effects of chemotherapy and radiation and all of that. So what he did was talk to one of his oncologists at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. He was seeking treatment down in Houston for his rare cancer. And his doctor down there got him in touch with Steve Curley, who was a surgeon down there who does cancers of the liver. He's a liver surgeon who also does a lot of research. And Dr. Curley was kind of interested in John at first in the idea, but as John explained more, he jumped on board and started doing some experiments with the device. And a little bit to Dr. Curley's surprise and to John's satisfaction, the early results were very positive. First in cancer cells in Petri dishes that were treated with his device, and also later in small animals where tiny pieces of metal called nanoparticles were injected into the bloodstream. They were treated with something so they would attach to cancer cells, and then the animal would be put into a radioactive field with John's device, and what would happen is the tiny nanoparticles would heat, destroy the cancer cells, but since they only attach to the cancer cells, nearby healthy cells would not be affected. So it was a treatment unlike chemotherapy, which also kills lots of healthy cells in the area. Right. This treatment would kill many of the cancer cells while leaving the healthy cells undamaged, or most of the healthy cells undamaged. These experiments were, reports were in many different magazine articles. We reported on them much during the 2005 to 2010. It seemed like everything was on track toward human trials. Mm-hmm. And in fact, at one point, there was talk about doing human trials. It advanced to the stage in human trials where they thought it was going to happen in Italy during the summer of 2016. Right. Unfortunately, at that point, John died 9 years ago from the effects of his cancer. And that's kind of when things took a bit of a turn as far as the whole project is concerned. What's happened lately is that after John died, his family sold the rights to the device. So to take you back a little bit, there's kind of the whole Kanzius project is two different tracks. One is the device. The device themselves, there were patents for it, and the device itself has always been owned by for-profit companies. The first one, John created and involved his family and some other folks. The other part is the research, which is where the money has gone and all the work has gone.
Right.
So what happened with that is while the research was going on, John passed away and his family a few years later sold the rights to the device to a company. And that company, Akeso Gen X, assumed the rights. They had the patent rights for the device and kept on going with the research, but then problems started to happen.
So continue with them.
Sure. One of the problems was, while research was going on in Houston, and also there was research at UPMC in Pittsburgh, the company had some financial problems. In a lawsuit that was filed, they sued their CEO, Robert Zavala, for basically embezzling a couple $1 million from the company. And a lawsuit at about the same time was filed. Research had moved from MD Anderson in Houston to Baylor in Houston, still underseen by Steve Curley, but research was being done at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. Baylor filed a lawsuit against the company that replaced Akeso Gen X. That company's called Neotherma Oncology. Akeso Gen X, it basically was the same board of directors with a couple differences, minus the CEO, Robert Zavala, who had been sued by the previous company for embezzlement. So what happened was Neotherma had sponsored a 3-year, $9 million research contract with Baylor. Baylor claimed that Neotherma failed to make the payments on that contract, whereas Neotherma counterclaimed that Baylor was not following the rules of the contract. Unfortunately, the lack of payments slowed research down. This was happening about 2014, 2015, and as a result, we got less and less news, especially up here in Erie, about the project and as it was going on. We didn't see as many developments. The talk about human trials kind of faded. We made calls down there. Dr. Curley would respond with emails that there is still research going on, but that he had to lay off staff. There wasn't many people working on it down there. And what eventually happened is the lawsuit between Akeso Gen X and its former CEO was settled, or I'm sorry, wasn't settled. That was found, the CEO was found guilty, and he had to repay the money. And the other one with Neotherma and Baylor was settled. Neotherma agreed to make certain payments. And then this takes us to October of last year, when I found out about a couple weeks ago from Dr. Curley, once that lawsuit between Baylor and Neotherma was settled, Neotherma came in to Curley's research labs at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston and removed all the Kanzius devices from his labs. I don't remember if he has 2 or 3 devices. I don't know how many he had down there. But since they own them, they took them. Dr. Curley doesn't know where the devices are, and Neotherma has possession of them, and that's kind of where we're at right now. We don't know where the devices are.
So talk a little bit about, you've been in contact with Curley. What's his disposition, or what is his attitude toward this right now?
It's hard to get his attitude. Basically, Dr. Curley's responded to me through emails. We really haven't had a phone conversation in a while. And when I asked him, I had sent an email to him about 3 weeks ago asking what the latest was in light of the lawsuit being settled. And he emailed me back that they took all the devices. Very factual, very matter of fact, just in a couple declarative sentences, that he no longer has access to the devices. He is no longer permitted to do research on the Kanzius device or use the Kanzius process, and he doesn't know. He referred all other questions to Neotherma.
A lot of people, like when we posted the story, this story broke last week, right? Mm-hmm. You did this story last week. So a lot of people were asking, they donated to the project when John was alive. Mm-hmm. They're wondering, if they're going to get their money back or their donations back. Can you talk a little bit about what happened with that?
Well, part of this, and as many of folks out there know, this was more than just your typical research project when we're talking about Erie, Pennsylvania. This captivated northwestern Pennsylvania, along with people who lived in John's winter home in Sanibel, Florida. There were a lot of folks down there that were committed to this. This became it wasn't owned by the public, but they took possession of this on the spirit of it. Part of it because John was such a good communicator, a good salesman of the project, if you will. He would go out and talk publicly about it. He really kept the fires lit, kept public interest on this to an incredible degree. Shortly before he died, they created a new fundraising organization was created. There was a previous one, but there was a new one created called the Kansas Cancer Research Foundation. The job of that foundation was to raise money for research, mostly at MD Anderson. Research had been done at UPMC as well, but at that point, I believe most of the research was being done at MD Anderson, later at Baylor when Dr. Curley switched over from MD Anderson to Baylor. The foundation did they were incredibly successful at raising money. They raised $10 million for research on the Kanzius device. People in their obituaries in the Erie Times News would ask that money be donated to the Kansas Cancer Research Foundation instead of people buying flowers or people making donations to the American Cancer Society. Almost every day in the paper you'd see obits with Kansas Cancer Research Foundation. People were donating $5, $10. Also won a Pepsi Cola grant contest for $250,000 for research at the foundation. It was one of the big winners of this national contest that Pepsi ran. Yeah. It was an incredible deal. So $10 million was raised through the foundation. Most of that money, about $9 million, was spent on research at MD Anderson, hiring additional staff, all the day-to-day costs of running what was a pretty darn big project down at MD Anderson and later at Baylor. The money that was left over, roughly $1 million, was divided among 3 different cancer centers, including the RCC here in Mill Creek Township. And the idea was that money would be used to pay the cost for second stage human trials for the Kanzius device if it went that far. What we have learned, and it was in the article that came out last week, is that if such human trials aren't scheduled by July of next year, that money will be used for other cancer treatments, other clinical trials, something to do with cancer. The money will be spent on cancer treatment, though not necessarily on the Kanzius device.
It's disappointing for a lot of people we know.
And as far as we know, there is no active, there's no work on the process, on this original process. Nobody's working on this treatment.
I'll tell you what we can do, and that was Chris asking that question. What we can is tell you what we know, and there's a lot we don't know. According to Dr. Curley, Neotherma has possession of all the devices that he had at Baylor. I had talked to Dr. David Geller at UPMC, and he still has an older device that was used for earlier research at UPMC. He still has possession of that device, but it is an older device. He had told me he hadn't done any research on that in 4 years. So I know Neotherma has possession of the devices, at least according to Dr. Curley. I have tried to contact Neotherma, which is a small LLC. It's a small venture capital company based out of Kansas. The state, Kansas, the state. They have not returned a single call. I've called them repeatedly ever since the company was created after the Queso Gen X. I've never heard back. I've even found the personal cell phone numbers for their CEO and their CFO, have not responded to my calls. So I don't know what they're doing with the devices. I don't know if anyone other than the people who are part of Neotherma know what's going on with the devices. There could be research going on somewhere. Someone else is doing it. They could be in storage. I have no idea. And that's what's frustrating.
Have you walk kind of backwards a little bit? When John's family decided to sell the patents, I think that's where a lot of people kind of got were upset. There's just that it was kind of going local to a national company. What was the thought process? Did you talk to the family when they?
I've talked to Mary Ann a couple times, and it was just, it was time. It's been a couple years, and my last interview with Mary Ann was, I believe, over about a year ago or even more. There was enough on her plate. This was John's thing. She wanted to see it come to fruition. She continued for several years after John's death, but that it needed to go somewhere else. She wanted to have someone else direct it, and it wasn't right for her to continue doing it. And so it was helped through Queso Gen X. There was a role that Dr. Curley played in all this. It's through some legal documents. There was a role that he helped bring it together in some way, shape, or form. Not sure exactly how that was, but they sold the patent rights, which certainly they're eligible to do. And it wasn't strictly the Kanzius family. There was a company that John created, and the name of it escapes me. And some of the members of that company were not just John and Mary Ann Kanzius. There were some other folks in that company. But that company sold it to a Queso Gen X. And for a while, things seemed to have gone smoothly. Research was continuing, articles were being published, and then the lawsuits.
I mean, it was just I think the article that I was looking at was from 2015 that they said, okay, we're going to go forward with human trials in Italy. So it didn't necessarily, when John died, go straight downhill. I mean, there seemed to be some momentum building.
Absolutely. It seemed like for several years. And then looking back, what seemed to happen, according to legal documents, again, Dr. Curley has very little to say about this, and nobody else is talking much on the record about this at all. It seems that the lawsuit between Queso Gen X and its CEO is the key. That he was charged with embezzling and actually found guilty of embezzling this $2 million, and that was money that probably impacted the research, and that caused everything to kind of grind to a halt eventually.
So from a reporting standpoint, where do we go from here?
That's the tricky thing. And that has been the problem the last couple of years. When John was alive, I'll tell a little bit of a story. And when John was, I wasn't the first reporter to start working on the Kanzius story. Pete Penapento, when this story first broke, it broke. John was just absolutely enthralled with his early experiments. Understandably so. A very passionate man, a smart man. He had lunch with Ed Mead, our former publisher here at the Times, and talked to Ed about this and said, this is incredible. This is going to change cancer treatment forever. He wanted to see if the Times was interested in doing a story about it. And Pete did the first several stories on this over the first couple of years of this. So that's how it all started. When Pete Penapento left the paper, I started doing the stories on the device, and it really kind of went from there as far as our involvement in reporting it.
One of our viewers, Kim Lombardozzi, is saying that she has her husband's family friends went to Russia, and a friend, one of those friends who had cancer, went to Russia and used the Kanzius device when he had 2 weeks to live, apparently, and now he's in remission. Do you know of anybody who actually used this device on anyone in any way in human trials?
One person, John Kanzius. John used it on himself. It's in the 60 Minutes episode. We reported on it. He did at one point late in his fight with the disease use it on himself to try to stave off the cancer for his own well-being. Can't blame him for that. Not exactly the protocols for it, but yeah, he ended up saying that in the 60 Minutes interview and also said it to me.
As far as you know, there have been no human trials or usages of any kind other than John.
Not that we know of. Again, it's been very difficult. One of the toughest parts about reporting this the last couple of years has been that there aren't, the owners of the device don't return any calls, the folks with Neothermon. Dr. Curley will respond, but he's pretty tight-lipped, especially compared to John when he was alive. There's no foundation for someone to talk about. There's no reason, for someone to keep the Kanzius device in the public awareness, because back when the foundation, even after John's death, with the foundation up and running and seeking donations, it was key for them to keep news about the device going. Mm-hmm. So it's tough. But we'll keep digging. I mean, this story's not over.
And John had cancer before he started testing a
He did. I remember, I actually, though Pete Penapento was the one who started the stories about the Kanzius device, I had interviewed John. In fact, I think the first time I ever met him, I did a story about John and his illness. He was well known enough in the community that when he was diagnosed with this rare cancer and was being treated for it, that in itself was news. I still remember sitting down with him at the Regional Cancer Center and talking with him about his cancer and his battle.
I think that's kind of what's most frustrating for a lot of people is the fact that we haven't gotten to know we haven't gotten the satisfaction or the dissatisfaction of knowing, will this ever, or does this really work?
Yes.
Did he have something here? So,
right. It's been frustrating because the news has been good. Now again,
right.
With research, they're not going to publish. They're not going to talk too much about what didn't work.
Right.
And in more recent years, there was a switch from Originally, the tests were on the device on nanoparticles. How it was done originally, not originally, but for much of the time that research was being done, you would inject these nanoparticles, which are used in many different ways now. But these nanoparticles were attached with an antibody that would make these nanoparticles attached to cancer cells but not healthy cells. So you would inject let's say the small animal with that, and then you would put the animal in the RF field. And that would then heat up those cancer cells, they would explode, die, kill the cancer. Mm-hmm. Later on, what they found was that it was working best when combined with low doses of chemotherapy. So instead of replacing chemotherapy, it was replacing much of the amount of chemotherapy, which is a good thing because the less chemotherapy you take, the fewer side effects you have. And they were having some success with that. But again, in more recent years, research had slowed down because of the issues with the company and with Neotherma and the contract. We haven't seen as many results.
And you did talk about how Neotherma won't return your calls. Have you been able to learn anything about the company, maybe through tax filings or any financial documents that are publicly available?
It's a small venture capital company. It's not a big business. And what we've been able to find, mostly through the legal fighting, the legal lawsuits it's had with Baylor, is basically, as far as that, it was almost, that was created basically for the Kanzius device and for perhaps a couple other devices.
So we don't know if, tell us a little bit about you said that July of next year, there's a timeline on if they can do human trials.
Right.
Why is there a timeline on it? Do you know?
And it was just made back when this fund was created, and I believe that was 2014. I think it was because it was 5 years.
Okay.
They just wanted a timeline on it. For the RCC here in Erie, remember, which was one of 3 accounts that were set up. That I think one's at MD Anderson and the other one's down near Sanibel. Cancer centers in all 3 locations. The Erie contract is through the Erie Community Foundation. They hold the funds. I think it was just because it was 5 years. Now, I'm not 100% positive on that, but I believe that was 5 years after the fund was created.
And viewer Mike McClellan is just checking in. He would like to know if you can give us more details about any companies or medical teams that are trying to build off of the Kanzius research in any way, or taking it in a different direction, or any details you can have on that?
I don't know about other companies. Again, with Neotherma not responding to any types of calls, I don't know what they're doing with the device. Now, Dr. Curley in one of his emails said John's had a valid project. His basic idea was valid. Dr. Curley and the folks at Baylor are continuing to do research in this general area, not on the device, not using the Kanzius protocol. He's not allowed to do that anymore. But in other areas on the same basic idea, they are doing further projects and seeing some success, he said. But not on the Kanzius device itself, not on anything that is trademarked as part of the Kanzius project.
So Neotherma is not associated with Baylor at all anymore?
No, we don't know. We don't know what Neotherma is doing. We'd love it if they see this video and give me but they have not. I mean, I've probably called between their office number, which is a cell phone number, and their private cell phone number. I've probably left 10 messages, and no, they're not. They are not returning calls.
So that's kind of where the research stands right now, is that Baylor might be doing something similar.
Something similar. Well, they are. According to Dr. Curley, they are doing something in the same general area.
Okay.
Exactly how, I don't know. But again, he was very careful in his email to say, not on the Kanzius device, which they don't have anymore, and not using as he called it in email, the Kanzius process. So how different it is, I don't know, but it is different in at least in the specific ways that John's was.
So take us into kind of Curley's involvement. You know, it felt like, especially as a reader, that he was very invested in this, you know, from the get-go. You had conversations early on when John was alive, you know, and his involvement with this. Did he seem like he was really, you know, kind of attached to it? I mean...
Well, the way Steve Curley would talk about it is he was very reluctant at first about the project. You know, how is this going to work? How is this broadcaster, this engineer, going to change cancer treatment when all these researchers, many of them are PhDs, MDs, haven't been able to do it? How could he change the course? But as the research continued, it went from petri dishes to small animals to larger animals. He was absolutely on board, and he was incredible with what John had done. They became friends. They talked a lot together. It'd be funny. John would call the paper frequently. In fact, I'm running a Good Morning column about this that'll run tomorrow. John would call me a couple times a month and just love to talk about his device. Now, being a broadcaster, he was savvy enough. He'd say, "Oh, David, this is off the record," and then he'd talk for 5 minutes. I would then say, "All right, I'm going to call Dr. Curley, see what he says." "Yeah, you do that." And I'd call him, and Dr. Curley would sigh and goes, "John's been talking again, hasn't he?" But they were close. Dr. Curley made several trips to Erie. Some of this was to help raise money for the foundation, but they also became very, very close friends. John's funeral, it was obvious that Dr. Curley was very shaken by this. His role in the research, he was the lead researcher. When he was MD Anderson, the research was MD Anderson. When there were issues there and he went to Baylor, he led the research there. There is some involvement he had with putting something together as far as a queso was. Never really been able to untangle that exactly, but he did play a role in getting people together at least. Perhaps in the future we'll have a little bit more on that. But he was very much, he was involved. It was John and Steve.
Will you continue to have contact with Curley since he's pretty much the only?
I'll email him if when things come up. Really, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Dr. Curley's been very, very blunt about it. You got to talk to Neotherma. They've got the devices. They own the patent rights. There's no research being done at Baylor.
So physically, we don't even know where the devices are.
No. They could be at a different research center with a team doing research on them as we speak.
Right.
Or they could be in storage, or they could be back in somebody's garage where they started.
All right, guys. So David will continue to cover this.
Absolutely.
And try, to kind of get some details surrounding this. I know that a lot of people are personally invested, like we talked about earlier. So for more information, keep an eye out on GoErie.com. We just had more on this story last week that kind of sparked this live discussion. Feel free to email David dbruce@timesnews.com. But he will keep you updated as this story develops and hopefully get some answers for you guys. So thanks, David, so much for all you do for this. I know that a lot of people listening and watching are really appreciative. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys later.